Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to Kerala Museum and the JANAL Lecture Series. The Kerala Museum, with the support of the Geojit Foundation, launched the JANAL Digital Archives program last year to mark the 35th anniversary of the museum. This initiative pays homage to the museum's creator, R. Madhavan Nair, and his lasting dream of bringing history within the reach of all. He conceived the museum as a cultural haven devoted to immersive learning experiences in history, fine arts, and performing arts. The JANAL Digital Archives uncovers Kerala's lesser-known histories, bringing storytelling to a wider audience. The JANAL Lecture Series, organized as part of the JANAL Digital Archives, commenced in July this year and presents a plural and inclusive narrative of Kerala. Today, in the 13th lecture, we present the topic, What is the Chemical Formula of Forest Tears? By Dr. Malavika Binny. Dr. Malavika Binny is the head of the department and assistant professor at the Department of History, Kannur University. She earned her PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University on the topic, Bodies, Power and Identities in Pre-Modern Kerala. She has previously served as an assistant professor at distinguished institutions, including the Department of History at SRM University, Amaravati, and Christ University, Bangalore. Notably, she is the youngest member of the Executive Council of the Indian History Congress. Recognized for her scholarly contributions, Malavika Binny has been awarded numerous prizes and scholarships, including the Erasmus Mundus Visiting Scholarship at Leiden University, Netherlands, for the academic year 2014-2015. Malavika Binny has an extensive publication record and is a regular speaker at the academic conferences and other public events. We are so happy to have you here, ma'am, and I warmly welcome you to the podium. Yes, I warmly welcome you, ma'am, to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, let me thank the Kerala Museum, its director, the wonderful Aditi Sakriyas, the curator, Rajeshwari Ashok, and all of you who are present here. And let me also particularly put in my thanks to the organizers of this particular JANAL lecture series. I believe that this is indeed an path-breaking kind of an initiative taken by any museum in Kerala, and it was a very, very significant intervention. So as someone who did part of her PhD at Leiden in the Netherlands, we had something called the Museum Nacht and the Museum Cart, where if you took a ticket to a single museum, you would get 50% off at some other museum. So there was this culture of museal spaces and spending time at the museum, and there would be 1 year which would be dedicated as a year of museums, and within a year you would have a particular night where students and the public would be invited to spend a night at the museum. So you had all these activities at the museum, and I have forever been a museum lover. In fact, while I was a student at St. Teresa's College, I had participated in a competition which was organized by the Madhavan Nair Foundation at Kerala Museum, and I had won the first prize. It was an essay competition, and I had won the first prize here. So this kind of shows how entangled one's life can be, and how for a student who was maybe 17 years old, coming here and having a look at you had the Dole Museum. I think the wax figurines were still being put in at that point of time. So it kind of impressed upon me the kind of expansiveness and diversity that museal spaces could offer. So let me put on record my huge appreciation for the work that is being done here. May you inspire many more young budding historians and history lovers and history buffs today and in the future. So moving on to my topic for the day, which is what is the chemical formula of foresters. Now this is also one of my, so I am what you would call as a crackpot historian. I try experimental methods all the time, sometimes successful, sometimes not so successful. I try to make history less pedantic. So sometimes I am also accused of being less scholarly. That is a blame that I will live with. As long as history is made interesting, as long as it reaches the public, as long as it opens up horizons of critical thinking in the minds of my students, researchers, and it moves us to think in diverse ways, I feel my job as a historian is done. So the lecture will be also an experiment in non-linear history. So those of you who are used to more chronological ways of mapping history might be slightly annoyed at the way that I am presenting this particular lecture. So please pardon me for that. But it is very, very rare that a historian gets such an occasion to also try and experiment with new kinds of methods. So I am taking that liberty now. So the title of this lecture, it kind of came to me in a conversation with a tribal activist. So I have been someone who has been engaged in the history of knowledge production for about a decade now. It started with an MA thesis and then progressed into an MPhil thesis and became two of my chapters of my PhD thesis as well. So I was looking at this particular 12-volume text called Hortus Malabaricus, and as a lot of you would know, you have references to more than 700 kinds of flora being mentioned in the Hortus Malabaricus, produced in the 17th century. Part of its publication being done in Amsterdam, some of it being published also at The Hague, so on and so forth. So the production of herbariums in Europe in the 17th century, in the 18th century, and the emergence of botany departments and the setting up of botanical gardens. This had become a major avenue of research in the post-2000s European academia. So you would see, for instance, Richard Drayton, who worked on the Imperial Botanical Gardens, which came up in Britain first. So you have the Gardens of Pew coming up, and then you have the Copenhagen Natural History Museum coming up. So this was also a period where botany is growing as a science. Now, scholars who are slightly more critical, like Loda Screbinger, she would argue that at this point of time, botany was not just big science, it was also big business. Because there was also a very vested imperial interest in pursuing botany as a science, of what could be produced and what would be the nature of the different kinds of agricultural products that could be produced in areas across the British Empire or the French Empire. So botany as science and botany as business went hand in hand. So post 2000s there has been a lot of interest in botany emerging as a major science, but there has also been attempts to look at other kinds of ways in which the physical world as well as the environment were imagined at this point of time in Europe. So a lot of scholars like Kapil Raj, for instance, in relocating modern science, he asks the question, would you find a rupture at this particular point in history in people imagining about the environment, in people's perceptions about their own surroundings? Because this is very clearly a Europe which is edging towards the Industrial Revolution. The Commercial Revolution had already taken place, inventions were happening, it was the post-Renaissance period. So a lot of rapid changes were happening. It's also a time when you have post-humanist thinking, not most humanism as of now, but humanism as a cultural phenomena in literature had emerged. So in academia, in public discourse, there was a lot of changes happening in understanding and imagining the environment. So a lot of scholars started mapping out this difference. So Drayton, for instance, argues that at this point of time, Britishers, they were in the pursuit of a new Eden. They started feeling that the Eden that they had in England, in Scotland, which was this very idyllic space, had been lost. So now they needed to figure out a new place which could become a new Eden for them. So there was the imaginary or imagined space of Eden, which could be recovered from, let's say, a tropical place like the Indian subcontinent or the Latin American continent. But it could also be a very real space. So there were also pursuits for finding the lost Eden, the actual Eden. So both these strands, both these sets of thoughts led to expeditions to figure out where Eden is. But along with this, you also see bioprospecting ventures happening, which we will get to towards the second part of the lecture, where you had the colonial machinery, the imperial machinery, trying to figure out what would be the products which could be monetized. So this is early proto-capitalism, early proto-colonialism for you. So bioprospecting ventures like the ones that has been mentioned by Ines Supanov, for instance, had also started. They went hand in hand with phenomena like Catholic Orientalism and Orientalism. Now, my job here is not to complicate things for you, but to make things easier for you. So let me just say that this was a very complicated era. That is what I am trying to impress upon you. So the early modern period, that is the period from the 16th century onwards till around the 20th century, this was an extremely complex era in terms of intellectual shifts that Europe witnessed. I hope you have understood that much. But this was the kind of thinking that emerged in Europe at this point of time. It had a very long-lasting impact on how people started thinking about the environment, started thinking about forests and so on. And this impact went way beyond the shores of Europe and reached India as well. So that is why the conversation that I had, which led to this title, becomes very, very interesting for me. Where when I went to have, so when I started working with Hortus malabaricus, I had this idea that maybe I can also contribute to botany by looking at plants and trying to identify those plants which might not have been identified. It was way over my, I was way in over my head. And a historian contributing to botany can happen, but somebody who was just doing her MPhil contributing as a student of history, as a student of history of science, at that point of time, maybe my skill set was not good enough. But I had this discussion with a tribal activist, and she showed me a set of herbs, and one of the herbs was Kannur. So this was very interesting for me that you had such a poetic name to a herb. And I asked her about the provenance of Kannur, or what can be translated as forest tears, and she told me that you have this in a very small pocket in regions around Wayanad, and only a very small group of people knew that it could be used as a herb for treating conjunctivitis. Has it been proven? No. Will it be proven in the future? Maybe. But what was interesting for me was that you had such a herb and it had such an interesting title. So years later, when I joined a university in India, after I submitted my PhD thesis and all, I had a conversation with someone who was teaching environmental science, and I told that professor that there is this herb called forest tears. And then suddenly he asked me, oh, what would be the Latin name for it? And I was like, probably it has not entered the medical or the botanical lexicon yet. But the fact that we could think in dimensionally different ways about the environment, where I was more interested in the title, I was more interested in the fact that a forest could cry, and people could imagine a forest crying. And people could imagine that the tears of the forest could become medicine for a set of people. And that medicine had very close connections with a disease of the eye, which is conjunctivitis. So this was very interesting for me. But for someone who had an environmental science background, he was more interested in the chemical formula or the Latin name of that particular herb. So it impressed upon me the idea that we have a lot of ways in which people think about the environment and think about the forest. And this particular study emerged from that particular line of thought, which occurred to me that did we start thinking of the forest in monolithic ways during the colonial period, or do we see the same line of thinking in the pre-colonial period as well? Now, thinking about the forest is very, very crucial to the construction of the ontological self. For instance, your understanding of what is civility as opposed to what is barbarism, or your understanding of the very fine boundary between the village and the forest, between the Caste and the Nadu, between the wild and the domestic, between the tame and the wild. All of this is also shaped by one's imagination of the forest. Now, one might not immediately associate the idea of civility, the idea of normativity with the forest, but there is this long intellectual history to which a lot of political historians, economic historians, environmental historians, as well as social historians have contributed and have shown that this, for instance, Champakalakshmi talks about the emergence of the Nadu and how the Nadu became a political unit. So, a certain kind of background to the Nadu is the extraction of forest resources, the extraction of resources from the buffer zone. So one can even ask the question, would the emergence of a village, would the emergence of a political unit such as the Nadu be possible without it delineating itself from the forest? You have K.N. Ganeshan writing very eloquently in Keralathinte Innalegal about the kind of binary division into Kadu and Nadu, which was present till the early historic period. And when you move to the medieval period, you have the emergence of the Parambu Puredam economy. Now, that's one way to look at the forest, where the forest is thought of as that distinguishing element between what the state thinks of as an ideal political unit and what it considers to be an area which it does not have complete control over. So that's one way to think about the forest. But there are other ways in which forests have been imagined and understood as well. Next slide, please. So if you ask me, where do you find the first reference to the forest in India, I would maybe, and this is highly debatable, I would maybe refer to this picture where you can see a lot of animals, from antelopes to tigers to wild buffaloes, bisons, being represented on this rock surface from Bhimbetka. This is possibly from the Mesolithic period, but Bhimbetka had a very long period of habitation till around the 15th century CE. So we are not very sure that this particular wall is from the Mesolithic period, but since you do not have representations of crowned figures, you do not have representation of elephants with mahouts, this is possibly a earlier image. So this might have been how early cave people who lived in India thought about the forest. Now, what is also very interesting for me in this picture, something that you would also have thought about, I am sure, is the absence of absence of trees, but you have a whole lot of animals. Wild animals and animals which were domesticated later, but this is also a forest, isn't it? So you can actually imagine a forest which is bereft of trees. So, and then we'll get back to this image towards the end of the talk. But please keep this in your mind that there are the way that we visualize a forest could also differ. For instance, a wasteland could also be called as a jungala. So Francis Zimmerman, he takes a very structural approach to the study of what he dubs as Hindu medicine and what passes off as Ayurveda. So that's material for another lecture, so I'm not going there. So he has written this interesting work called Jungle and the Aroma of Myths. So in that he makes this argument, jungala, as opposed to the jungle of today, referred to wastelands or barren lands. It was not a reference to the forest. So old land was divided into wetlands, dry lands and forest. And the dry lands were referred to as jungala. So Ayurveda, imagining about the forest, would imagine about the wasteland and from the wasteland. Now the term wasteland of course is debatable because nature has no waste at all, and it's human beings like us who use terms like wastelands for areas which lie barren or which are left barren so that it can rejuvenate itself. But this was the way in which Ayurveda conceptualized the jungle or the forest. Next slide please. So for me, Zimmerman kind of showed me the way, but as Gananath Obisekere has written in critiquing Zimmerman, Zimmerman's work also had the aroma of structuralism, not just the aroma of jungle meats. So I started thinking whether we can also think of the forest in post-structural ways, not be very impacted by the state or state centrism in constructing a cultural history of the forest. So usually we have this tradition in history writing and in historiography that whenever we talk about any cultural phenomena in Indian history, we take it all the way back to the Vedas. I am not going to do that in this lecture. So I am going to start with the Puranas, because Puranas, unlike the Vedas, were very easily circulated among the people, and it till date has a lot of reception among the people. So in the Puranas, you would see the forest as a storytelling space. Now it was not just a place which figured in stories. For instance, you would have a lot of references to the forest in the Jatakas, in the Panchatantra, in a lot of early Buddhist literature. But I am not referring to that here. I am referring to the fact that the forest itself served as a space of storytelling, where you would have references to princes and princesses going to the forest and listening to stories from seers, listening to stories from yoginis. You would also have plenty of references to gurus telling stories and anecdotes to the shishyas. You would also have kings retiring to the forest to resolve political or other kinds of conflicts and taking advices from celestial beings like the yakshas or actual people like the seers. So in many ways, the forest not only served as a space which led to stories, or not only served as a background for stories, the forest itself became a storytelling space. For instance, if you look at the Mahabharata, you would see Janamejaya's Yagna starting off in the forest. And then you would have Janamejaya being told the story of Mahabharata as if it is going to happen in the future, though it had happened in the past. So this also indicates the kind of cyclical understanding of time that pervaded epics such as Mahabharata and Ramayana. But what is of interest to me is the fact that the setting for a lot of these yagas and yajnas was the space of the forest. So you also had stories which A.K. Ramanujan talks about, where yakshas would speak to each other after returning to the forest and after having gone to the village and towns, and they would exchange stories with each other. So you would have such stories which were being recalled and recounted in the space of the forest as well. So one way that we can think about the forest is of the forest as a storytelling space. Similarly, next slide please. Another way that one can think about the forest is of the forest as a sacred space. Now, I need not explain much about this to a Malayali audience. All of us know about our sacred groves. But beyond the sacred groves, you could also see the presence of forest shrines, which were very unlike the groves. So a religious pilgrimage, for instance, would be to a forest shrine, and this would be a very densely populated forest where you would have the very real danger of wild animals. So part of the pilgrimage, part of the person who was undertaking the religious vow was also for him or her to undergo that experience of liminality as well as that of danger, where you move from the village to the forest, and in the forest you encounter many kinds of hardships, many kinds of dangers, and then you reach your goal. So one can also think of the forest as a sacred space, and unlike other kinds of sacred spaces, these spaces in many ways were also non-hierarchical spaces and non-Brahmanical spaces. You could see tribal people as priests or acting in multiple capacities as ritual specialists in these forest shrines. You could see subversions of caste, you could see subversions of Brahmanical food taboos such as vegetarianism in these forest shrines, and this set of traditions continue till date. So, and as I said before, to jump from the time of the Puranas all the way till the time of the Mughals, and this is from a Mughal miniature produced in the 16th century, if I am not wrong, where you would see a princess visiting a forest shrine, and this particular painting is titled as Princess Visiting for a Forest Shrine. So even in the 16th, 17th century, in literature produced and paintings produced by Mughal artists, you would see representations of young women going to the forest. Now this could be for the fulfillment of a vow, this could be as a penance for a sin which was committed, this could be for soliciting advice. So but this idea of the forest as a sacred space, and a sacred space which is filled with liminality, where you would have to move away from conventional ideas of bhakti or conventional ideas of sacrificing oneself or surrendering oneself to one particular deity, the deity that you would encounter in a forest, conventional deity. And a lot of these forest shrines would not have named deities. You would have a Vaishnavite shrine which would also act as a Shaivite shrine. You would have a Bhagavati shrine which would also be a Jaina goddess shrine. So the nature of the forest shrines were ones where you also had a certain kind of fluidity in terms of the identity of the deities which were present in these forest shrines. But I am also not saying that these were very secular places, because we are talking about a time when secularism had not emerged at all. We are just talking about religious fluidity, which could be attached to the idea of forest shrines, and maybe it was a space of the forest which accommodated such fluidities to be present. Moving ahead, next slide please. Now you have several references to the Nada yogis and as well as the presence of yoginis in the forest. This is among one of the many pictures that you can find in the National Museum of India, as well as in the digital archive of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where you would in particular see the representation of female seers or yoginis. Now you have representation of female Sufi saints, you have a representation of female yoginis, and these yoginis are visited by either princesses or by noble women. Romila Thapar, for instance, have in the work titled The Renunciant, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the entire title. But Romila Thapar, she has talked about the agency of the renunciant, where when we think of a renunciant, we think of someone who has renounced everything and who has moved to the forest and who has cut off all ties with the world, who has very little sense of attachment to worldly pleasures or material cravings. But she argues that in the historical record, if you find a renunciant, he or she would be a renunciant who would not have detached himself or herself or themselves completely. The fact that he had renounced material pleasure for a span of 10 years, a span of 12 years, would give him power, or would give, in this case it's always a him, but would give him power to make those interventions. So the renunciant was never just a renunciant. The renunciant was someone who always returned to the place from which he moved away and would make these very important social interventions. But we do not find textual references to yoginis coming back to the village or coming back to the chiefdom or kingdom to make those kind of interventions. So one is prompted to think whether there was also a gender difference in terms of the ways in which the renunciant could exert her influence here as a social agent. Similarly, the forest was considered to be a space of wisdom as well, and this you see in Buddhist literature, this you would see in Jataka tales, but more importantly you would also see this in the Mahabharata and Ramayana traditions, wherein, next slide please, wherein you had the idea of the forest being guarded by yakshas. And this is a very famous episode from Mahabharata, where during the exile in the forest, during the Vanaparva, you had all 4 brothers and Draupadi going and drinking water from a lake, and without seeking permission of the guardian deity of that particular lake, who was an yaksha. They fall dead or they fall unconscious, and finally Yudhishthira reaches the place and understands that that particular lake is being guarded by an yaksha, and starts talking happy, and Yudhishthira responds, a person who does not depend on others and who is free from debt is truly happy. So you have a set of questions being asked, and you would see the same trope being repeated in terms of other kings, in terms of the Jataka tales, in terms of royal mythologies, in terms of genealogies, let's say of the Mewar kingdom or the Marwar kingdom, where the king would go to the forest to seek wisdom, and there he would have this fantastical encounter. And that might be an encounter with a divine being, a semi-divine being. It could be an encounter with an animal. It could be an encounter with a sage, or it could be an encounter with disease or injury. And through that process of learning, he would come back with the wisdom to rule. Now, not just with regard to kings, you would find merchants traveling through the forest, and them talking to each other, talking to forest dwellers, and them picking up nuggets of wisdom, and you find a lot of references to such encounters, particularly in the Jataka tales. So this idea of the forest as a space of wisdom, along with it being a space of divinity, along with it being a space where stories were told, is something that was very, very present in the pre-modern imagination of the forest. Now, it is with the loading of colonial modernity that we started thinking of the forest as a place which is not associated with wisdom, which is associated with a set of people who might not possess the kind of wisdom that is required for us to survive in this world. So even when you have scholars such as Shareen Ratnagar producing a work like Being Tribal, and it's an excellent work, but it kind of also argues that the tribals have a very different rationality. Forest dwellers thinking in different ways, which would be fundamentally different from the ways in which the village dweller or the city dweller would think. Now this is what I am trying to argue here is that this is a false binary, where where you are trying to delineate the sets of rationality, or the sets of thinking, sets of mentalities that forest dweller would have, which is put in opposition with the ways in which the villager or the town dweller imagines himself to be, imagine the city to be, the way that he goes about or she goes about his or her life. Because there are various ways in which the tribals think of themselves, and various ways in which the tribals think about the forest, various rationalities at work. For instance, the ways in which a Kurichya would think about the forest, a Kurichya would have rationality, would be very, very different from the rationality of a Paniya, which would be very, very different from the rationality of, let's say, a tribal person who is from the forest of Karnataka or from the forest of Bengal. So this idea that all tribals think alike it's a very dangerous label to impose upon tribals, because when you mark out a boundary of distinction, it can be very easily used to brand them or brand any set of people as being non-dominant, as being subaltern. So what I am also trying to do here is to recast the forest as a space of wisdom. And that wisdom was not just the wisdom of sages, it was the wisdom of the forest. It was the wisdom of the forest dwellers. And this was a wisdom that the kings, the merchants, the village people, the townsfolk would tap into when they themselves were in trouble. And that is why in a lot of these Mughal paintings, particularly in Mughal miniature paintings, the forest is not only thought of as a space of wisdom, it is also thought of as a space of relaxation, where you would go to rejuvenate oneself, but not just physically, also intellectually. And as I would be arguing later, that is why the royal hunt, which has been very it has been thought of as in a very reductive manner, where the hunt is imagined as a hunting expedition just to kill animals. But the hunt would last for days, and the motive of the hunt was not just to kill animals. Of course, there was an element of the royal display of power, but at the same time, these were also expedition to gather information about the forest, information about the forest dwellers. But these were also times where the Mughal king or the Sultan could go retire to the forest and also rejuvenate himself, both intellectually as well as physically, but could also engage with the forest dwellers. And the kind of forest dwellers that we encounter in the pre-colonial forest, particularly in the medieval and the early medieval forest, were a very diverse set of people who possess diverse sets of knowledge. So some would have knowledge about herbs, some would have knowledge about the self, some would have knowledge about water bodies, some would have knowledge about hunting, some would have knowledge about medicine. And all these networks of knowledge could be found within the space of the forest. So it is very, very important for us to think about the forest, at least in pre-colonial India, also as a space of wisdom, also as a space of knowledge production. Moving ahead, yet another way in which the forest has been imagined in India is as a space of fantasy. Now, this is a paper that I have been working on for about 6 months now, where you see representations of multiple kinds of fantastical creatures in the forest. And this particular painting, the Gulshan-e-Ishaq, and the painting is one of the paintings that you will see in the illustrated copy of Gulshan-e-Ishaq, where you have the central character called Manohar visiting the forest. Now you can see a lot of fantastical creatures in the forest. You can see a dragon-like figure on top. You can see 2 tigers. You can also see a very Javanese-looking lion. You also have an anthropomorphic figure who could either be identified as a Nada Yogi or as Shiva. And this particular poem was composed by a Muslim poet in the court of the Deccani kings. And this poem was composed in Deccani, which was the official language which is used till the period of the Nizamate. So even in the 18th century, you have at least a set of courtiers, at least a set of patrons who would want to know more and more about the forest, and that is why they are patronizing poets to write about the forest. So the central character in the story is going to the forest. He is encountering with multiple sets of beings in the forest. He is again coming back with the wisdom of the forest. But the forest is also thought of as the space where you could have multiple beings from very diverse mythological as well as very real spaces coming together. That is why in this single picture you would see a very Chinese dragon and a very Javanese looking lion, a very Indic looking tiger, meeting up with a boy whose attire is very similar to the attire of Patani Muslims, but is characterized as a Hindu in this poem, written by a Muslim poet. Now imagine how complex the situation is, how layered it is, but also think about the kind of possibilities that were open to a poet in the Deccani courts, where you could imagine up such a situation where you could fuse together elements from multiple mythologies, some of which are Javanese, some of which are Chinese, some of which are Brahmanical, some of which are Puranic, and some of which are Sufi in nature. And you could bring all these threads together in a single poem, and that poem could find a patron. And this poem was also performed in Deccani in the court. So the idea of the space of the forest as a place where multiple sets of people came together, multiple sets of knowledge converged, critiqued and maybe challenged each other, where multiple mythologies could come together to dwell in. This is something that you see as a long-standing narrative in the cultural imagination of forest. You would see this in the Mahabharata, where you would see different sets of tribes being mentioned, and each tribe having its own characteristics, and each of these tribes coming back to help the Pandavas in the Kurukshetra war. So they are also being integrated to the state in multiple ways, but within the forest they could live in whichever unconventional way that they wanted to. So the idea of the forest as a liminal space where multiple ideas, multiple sets of knowledge, multiple sets of mythologies could converge together, this is something that you can one more. Okay, to an earlier period in history, one can also think of the forest as a heterotopic space. Now, this is a fancy term that I have borrowed from Foucault. Now, you don't need to read all of Foucault to understand what heterotopia is. Heterotopia, for me, an even more better word to use than heterotopia is Chakravala Kootam. Now, what is Chakravala Kootam? Chakravala Kootam is a place which is mentioned in the the post-early historic Tamil work called Manimekhalai. You must already know Manimekhalai. She is the daughter of Madhavi, who was besought by Kovalan. So in that particular story, Manimekhalai, she is being pursued by Udayakumaran, who is a prince, but she is someone who struggles to act, and then her moral dilemma is whether to become a Buddhist nun or to marry Udayakumar. So because she has feelings for Udayakumar, but she also wants to become a renunciant. And this is a very common trope that you would find in most Buddhist works. This intense conflict between the material and the otherworldly, the metaphysical world and the material world. So Manimekhalai is caught in this, but then Manimekhalai gets shifted by a god. So there is a human Manimekhalai and then there is a goddess Manimekhalai. So the goddess Manimekhalai transfers the human Manimekhalai to this fantastical place called Chakravala Kootam. And Chakravala Kootam is a place which is very, very antagonistic and very, very different and unconventional to the space of the conventional village, where the norms of the village, where the norms of the towns would be reversed or would be subverted. So I need not go to Europe to find Foucault to find heterotopia. We already had references to such spaces, such islands, or such places in early historic Tamil literature, which would have elements of subversion within it. But heterotopia is also an interesting concept for us, because when Foucault talks about heterotopia, he doesn't divorce it from the conventional. He argues that in every village you would have a heterotopic space. In every home you would have a heterotopic space, a place of challenge, a place of subversion, a place to which the norms of the society would be antagonistic. For instance, the space of the father's and mother's bedroom in a home, which is usually a place which is forbidden to the kids. No, not to. And then this is an analogy which doesn't work for us Malayalis, but in the European context, it is forbidden to kids. A place to which you would have to take permission to enter. Why? Because all the sexual activity in that space is contained within that room, and there is a kind of exclusivity of access to that space. But the usual sanitized homes that we have, where sex is a taboo word, where sexual activity is not discussed, the bedroom space of the master stands in antagonism to the rest of the house, which follows a very normative order. So within that heterotopic space, you could have very diverse kinds, very non-conventional kinds of traditions and practices in existence. Another such space would be the mental asylum, where you do not expect norms to be followed, conventions to be followed. Yet another space would be the brothel. Now, for any society to exist, you also needed a heterotopic space as a venting out space, as a space to which you would point to and say, oh, this is a place where bad things happen. Or this is a place where normal things don't happen. So you needed that space as a pointer to claim that this is not, there is a set of regulations that has to be followed within the non-heterotopic space. And if you wanted to take a small recess from conventionality, you could retire to the heterotopic space. But the heterotopic space also in many ways not only challenged and subverted what was normative, it would also define what is normative. Because there is also a limit to the kind of diverse discursivities that you could have in the heterotopic space, which would in turn inform what would be considered as normal. So just imagine this. If I ask you what is the opposite of health, what would you tell me? Sickness would be the opposite of health. But if I ask you, at what point would you declare yourself to be sick? It's a fussy area, isn't it so? At what boundary line or at what limit will you tolerate sickness till you declare yourself to be sick? If I ask you, no, all of us are living bundles of sickness, aren't we? Do we have perfect healthy bodies? Anybody in the audience, anybody who's listening to me online, is there anyone who does not have any even a single iota of sickness in their body? Because this
definition of health says your physical well-being and mental well-being.
chemical formula of foresters for you. That is one line of thinking about health you can. So WHO definition of health is well-being of?
Total physical and mental well-being and lack of sickness.
Which brings us back to the question of sickness. How would you define sickness?
Lack of sickness.
No, I am not asking about health.
The first two verses which I said give that definition.
No, you would have to define sickness for me, no?
Lack of sickness.
Health is lack of sickness. I agree. But how would you define sickness?
The first part of the sentence, the rest of a human being having physical well-being and mental well-being. Lack of sickness. That is health.
All right. But this is also a very loose definition, isn't it?
Done.
If you want to follow that line of thinking, I am absolutely okay with you following that line of thinking. But okay, that is another way. Thank you. That is another way that we can think of health. There is somebody else who wants to.
It progresses from the earlier, as you said in the earlier centuries, the Western way of things, from the just physicality to the mental.
Yes.
But it doesn't because there is something lacking, as you said. So they added the lack of sickness also as a just this thing. So it's a particularly dictionary definition that because if he's from a doctor and a professional, you have the functionality is very important. These lectures are not important there. People are coming, so they have to give this thing. But in you have to go for a deeper and a wider thing. So that is why your definition is more correct.
Sorry, back to him, please.
Being deeper to consider everybody as having not being healthy. Is that a deepness?
There is depth to it.
Okay.
And I'll get to that in a minute. Because if you are going to define health, now we are moving away from the topic, but there's a long history of how the definition of health emerged and how WHO took this particular definition of health, which is an extremely loose way and a vague way to define health. Now, as the gentleman over there said, in the initial phase it was only regarded as physical health, and then mental health was added to that, and then the lack of sickness was added to that, A, B or C. But all of this is premised on the Galenic understanding of health, which is based on the idea of humors, the constitutive humors being balanced out. And how sickness in many ways was something which would forbid you, or which would not let you perform your duties to the state, perform the duties that were prescribed to you by religion, perform the duties that you were supposed to do as a normative member of society, like reproduction, for instance, or production for that matter. And that is why for a very long period, a lot of diseases were not considered as diseases. And that is why I asked you for the definition. Either medicine would dub it as a normal biological process, but I might also be in very real pain. But then medical science would say, oh, that is pain that has to be tolerated by women. For a woman, you are supposed to bear it. It wouldn't be thought of as sickness. Only when research progressed, and only when women started arguing that female biological process should also be studied at depth, and certain biological processes which are considered to be normal should be interrogated. Did we have research moving in the direction of PMS? Did we have research moving in the direction of PCOS or PCOD? I can cite hundreds of such diseases which were declassified or reclassified. No, one tends to think that medicine does not have any politics behind it. Medicine has a 3,000-year-long set of political history. And that is why when WHO defines health in such a loose manner, you would have a lot of health economists, health historians arguing and saying that, no, please give us real definitions where, if we ask the question, does calorie count matter in terms of well-being? This number of calories that I have as an Indian citizen, that I have access to as a Indian citizens daily, which is based on my income, which is based on my social background, which is based on my economic background. How does that impact my health? How would poverty impact health? How would social background impact health? Now, it is very easy to come up with an individual definition of health. And states also subscribe to this idea of health, and they teach it in their textbooks, so that the states can also wash their hands off and say that, see, we have arrived at this particular parameter which has been prescribed by WHO. It is as easy as manipulating the poverty line and saying, oh, we do not have so much poverty in India because we have manipulated the poverty line and have given a very low bar to it. So this is the exact problem that I am getting to in a minute. This idea of disassociating people from their surroundings, the idea of extracting the cultural milieu from the ontological self, from the ways in which we imagine ourselves, is a capitalist ploy. And it has a history of 400 years now. And that is why when we talk about health, suddenly one only thinks about individual health. Now, Corona has shown to all of us that individual health again is a sham. Unless you have a supportive network, unless you have governmental mechanisms in place, can we even think of the health of a person, and particularly the health of a person who lives and who is a thinking, breathing part of society? So sometimes we also have to move beyond these definitions. These definitions are only starting points for us to think about things. It shouldn't be the end point. And one might also, it might be a good idea to open ourselves up to think about various phenomena, not just the forest, not just health, X, Y, or Z, in multiple ways. And maybe there is use to that. Okay, back to our topic. So you have the forest as the heterotopic. So what I was saying is that all of us, if I refer to all of us as people who are not completely healthy, who have some element of sickness and who live with some element of sickness, and think of that level of toleration as being healthy. That in turn helps the state. That in turn helps society. That in turn helps the functioning of the family. For instance, it might be the level of pain toleration of a housewife that leads to the normal functioning of a house. It might be the level of pain toleration in terms of childbirth that ensures of a young bride or a young mother who which makes sure that the family doesn't go bankrupt. So the boundaries that we have in terms of thinking about health, in terms of thinking about sickness, in terms of thinking about what it is to be civil, what it is to be normal, what it is to be normative, what it is to be unconventional. All of this can be challenged today, and if you look at the historical record, you would see that people lived way more fluid lives than the lives that we live today. In fact, we also live very fluid lives. It is just that we don't acknowledge it anymore. So if you look at the space of the forest during the Mughal period or during the time of the compositions of the later Puranas, you would see that this kind of a distinction between the forest and the non-forest spaces. For instance, the village boundaries is something that absolutely vanishes. One will not be able to figure out where the forest starts and where the village ends. Today we have a very fancy word for it called buffer zone. Now it has its own problems. I'm not entering into that. But this distinction of the forest and the village is something that has been contested by a lot of environmental historians. In fact, a lot of political history writing about the Nadu had to be reimagined when environmental historians started pointing out that in many ways you did not have the forest and the village, but you had the forest in the village. You had the forest in the town, where the forest was thought of as being part of the village, being part of the everyday lives of people in the village. So it was only after this movement called as the enclosure movement, where you had spaces being divided up and enclosed in Europe, that you had the emergence of a distinct space of the commons and the distinct space of the wood and the distinct space of individual mansions. But once the enclosure movement happened, you also had the space of the commons being usurped into. But in the case of India, you would see this kind of a fussy space. You would see this kind of a non-distinction between the village and the forest continuing as late as the 18th century. Now we were talking about forest as a heterotopic space where things which were non-conventional, non-normative would happen in heterotopic spaces. For instance, you would have references in, let's say, Rasa Leela, or references in Gita Govinda, or references in such Mughal paintings where women would be shown as bare-breasted, where women would be shown being frolicking in the water, or women would be shown embracing each other. Women would be shown in erotic postures with other women, Men would be shown in erotic postures with other men. You would have depictions of self-care, one woman combing another woman's hair, or smearing turmeric paste or sandalwood paste on another woman. You would have women helping other women to bathe. The number of paintings with women being depicted far outnumber those with men, but you also have men who are depicted in such activities, in frolicking in the water, swimming in the water, and all of this are either titled as being on the forest edge or being at the village's end, which is very curious for me, because you are calling it as the forest edge, not as the village's end or village's edge. You are giving significance to the fact that the forest was thought of as the boundary, but being within the boundary. So you have a lot of writing where the forest would be thought of as being the same as the Seema. But if you look at Mughal paintings, if you look at literature which is produced from let's say the 14th century, like for instance the medieval Champu Kavyams and the Sandesha Kavyams which are produced in Kerala, you would not have references to forest as boundaries, but the forest being within the boundaries and the boundary of the forest being thought of as the end of the village. I hope this distinction is clear. And it was in this space that you would have such activities happening, the heterotopic activities happening in a heterotopic space. Next slide, please. You would also have gender transfigurations and transgressions happening in the space of the forest. For instance, if you look at the Mahabharata, you would see the character of Shikhandin. Shikhandin going to the forest and meeting with a yaksha. So Shikhandin, when he matured and when he reached the marriageable age, his father found a bride for him. King Drupada found a bride, and this was the daughter of King Hiranyavarman. And because Shikhandin thought of or had memories of him being Amba in the previous birth, he thought of himself as a woman. So he couldn't consummate the marriage, and this young princess who was Hiranyavarman's daughter went back to the king and complained that my husband is not fulfilling his marital duties. And she gets very upset, and then Drupad gets very, very upset with Shikhandin, and Shikhandin, who's a brilliant warrior, by the way. Throughout Kurukshetra, you will not see a effeminate representation of Shikhandin. That effeminateness that has been attributed to Shikhandin is our thinking. In Mahabharata, you would see Shikhandin as a warrior who has military prowess, who is quite skilled in 32 arts which are associated with the war. So he is very crestfallen because in spite of him being this warrior, in spite of him being the heir apparent to the throne, his father gets upset with him because he is not able to consummate the marriage, and he goes to the space of the forest. And he goes to the forest, and in the forest he meets with a yaksha. Now the yaksha lets Shikhandin borrow his manhood, and Shikhandin goes back with the manhood that the yaksha has bestowed upon him and consummates the marriage. So the forest then also becomes the space of transfiguration, where genders are exchanged, where notions of femininity and notions of masculinity converge together, or they are critiqued and subverted. Or you could have such exchanges happening. Now, the space of the forest is in the early historic Tamil literature. For instance, in the Shilapadikaram, you have references to the Kovalan and Kannagi moving to the city of Pumpuhar. And while they are on their way to Pumpuhar, they move through the forest, and in the forest they meet with this sage-like woman who is called as Kavundi Adigal. Now Kavundi Adigal leads Kovalan and Kannagi to her hermitage. And the hermitage is a place which has an abundance of food. It's a place where magical spells work. It's a place where the trees chant Buddhist shlokas. So within the forest, you have a female saint who has who not only has supernatural powers, but a female saint who has also set up a hermitage where you have magical happenings being part of their everyday life. So this idea where you have the forest as a place where gender notions are subverted or inverted, where you have people moving from one kind of a gender role to the other, or one kind of gender form to the other. This is again a trope that you will see in the representation of forest, particularly in the pre-colonial period. Next slide, please. And then you would also have caste subversions happening in the forest. We all know about Shakuntala and her Gandharva marriage to Dushyanta. Now if you look at the Varna of Shakuntala and the Varna of Dushyanta, it is an Anuloma marriage. But the space of the forest allows such a marriage, where you could have a clandestine wedding, you could consummate that wedding, and you could have a child from that wedding, which would not be permissible in the very Brahmanic space of the village or the town or the kingdom. Similarly, the forest is also a place wherein when Rama is in exile, Shurpanaga could besought him, could express her desire to him. Now Shurpanaga, you should remember, is also depicted as a widow. So a widow expressing desire is a rarity in terms of Sanskrit literature. But herein in the space of the forest, you could have a Shurpanaga who proposes marriage to Rama and later to Lakshmana. You could also have the representation of a Hidumbi, who is represented as a demoness or rakshasa, depending on which recension of Mahabharata you are looking at, and Hidumbi getting married to Bhima. So you have an Asura Kshatriya marriage, or a tribal woman Kshatriya marriage happening again in the space of the forest, because the space of the forest was accommodative of such caste transgressions. And these marriages were also considered to be illicit marriages back in the village. That is why Dushyanta acknowledges Shakuntala. That is why Hidamba's son is acknowledged by Bhima. So these marriages, which would happen in the space of the forest, were not thought of as unions which were limited to the space of the marriage, but rather these marriages also gained legitimacy back in the space of the conventional, back in the space of the Brahmanical. Now you also have, now moving a little ahead, and that is why I refer to this as a non-linear history. Many years later, you have Tagore writing about Chitra. And Arjuna meets Chitrangada in a forest, and she is a warrior queen or a warrior princess who goes to hunt in the forest. Now she changes her form so that Arjuna falls in love with her, but she realizes that she cannot assume the form of this fragile, beautiful woman. Who she is actually the fierce warrior woman. So this is Tagore's poem, this is not from Mahabharata. And then she tells Arjuna that being a consort might also mean that I will be able to protect you. Being a consort might also mean that I could go to war with you, rather than wait for you to come back from the battle. So a different notion of what could be a partnership, a different notion of what could be a marriage also emerges within the space of the forest, where you could have gender stereotypes associated with even princesses being challenged. Next slide. And this becomes most clear when we look at the Rasalila tradition, where from Rajput and Mewar paintings, you have multiple representations of the forest as a erotic space, where Radha and Krishna engage in various acts of lovemaking, or where Krishna and Gopikas engage in various acts of lovemaking. And these paintings are as late as the 18th century. And these paintings were made by courtiers and court painters of the Mewar and Marwar kingdoms, and they were kept in the official abodes and the courts. So this was also a time when you could think of the forest also as a space, not only one where you have gender transgressions and gender subversions and caste transgressions and caste subversions happening. You could also think of it as a space of erotica, as a space where very freely engaging in activities of pleasure was thought of as being permissible or was accommodated. Now, till the 16th, 17th century, you have such multiple ways of thinking about the forest, where the forest could be a storytelling space, where the forest could be a heterotopic space, where the forest could be a space of wisdom, where the forest could be thought of as an abode of saints, where the forest could be thought of as a place where multiple knowledge traditions converge, where the forest could be thought of as a place where free desire could be expressed, where pleasure could be sought. So you have diverse ways in which or through which the forest was imagined. But all of this comes to be monetized or comes to be dominated by one single line of thinking when we move to the proto-colonial. Next slide, please. Period. Move ahead. Where from the proto-colonial period, you would see the forest being thought of in a very clinical manner. The forest now comes to be pathologized in many ways, where you would think of individual trees rather than a forest. You would think of the anjali, you would think of the chambagam, you would think of the jackfruit tree, and depict that in the herbariums, in the medico-botanical texts which were being produced from the 17th century. So if you look at the Hortus Malabaricus, particularly the preface to the Hortus Malabaricus in volume number 3 of Hortus Malabaricus, Van Rady talks about the very dense, luscious forest of South India. But that is the only reference that you will get to the forest. And it stops there. Because the intention of approaching the forest now becomes a monolithized interest of bioprospecting, where you're thinking of the forest in very utilitarian terms, where you start thinking of the forest not as a space, not as various kinds of spaces fused together into one. You start thinking of it as a resource base, where you start thinking or you start imagining the forest in very disassociated, cold, detached ways, where the forest is thought of with regard to its products, rather than as a space itself. So throughout Hortus Malabaricus, you would see such depictions, where the leaf would be represented, where the fruit would be represented, where you would have a very definite typology being followed, like the WHO health definition that was mentioned earlier. And this is a very linear typology that is being followed here. So earlier, if you had a banyan tree in a forest, that tree would be thought of as a meditative space. It could be thought of as a space of recreation. It could be thought of as a space of pleasure. It could be thought of as a space where for a shrine could come up. It could be thought of as a place where you would have the clandestine meeting of lovers. You had all those possibilities. But when we reach the 17th century, when Hortus Malabaricus or later Jardin de Lorixa or the earlier Garcia de Horta's work is being produced, you have a very clinical way of looking at the forest, where trees are looked at, herbs are being investigated and interrogated upon. But there is very little representation, very little conversation, very little discourse about the forest per se. So the tree or the herb or the flora would be mentioned in 4 different languages, all of which would contribute to the later emergence of the Linnean typology. And environmental historians such as Richard Grove have argued that this had a very Malayali episteme rather than a European episteme. Now that is something that I agree with. For instance, if you look at the titles here, Anjali is referred to as Anjali in Hindi also, in Konkani as well, written in the Devanagari script. Now Anjali would also be written as Anjali in the Arabic script as well. Very rarely, like in the case of very common products such as the coconut or papaya, which was widely known throughout the networks of knowledge production, such as the Columbian Exchange or the Transatlantic Exchange or the Indian Ocean Network of Knowledge Production, you would have such herbs, such flora being referred to in multiple languages. But in terms of other forest elements, you would have the Malayalam name or you would have the Tamil name being transcribed or transliterated into other languages. And that is why Grove argues that this is a Malayali episteme at work which found its way all the way into Linnean typology. Now, I am not contesting that, but for me, the bigger picture is about how this Malayali episteme was distilled from its cultural milieu, how it was divorced from the socio-cultural context or its provenance, where you have, in terms of nomenclature, a Malayali name being used, a Malayali title being used, but what purpose does it serve? The purpose that is being served here is the colonial interest, where herbs are being collected, bioprospecting is being done, but it is being straight-jacketed into what was then referred to as botany. And this was a very Eurocentric botany that you would see at this particular point of time, not that it has decolonized itself today. But you would see an extreme version of it at that particular point of time. So the classifications, the typologies, everything except the nomenclature would be one which serves the interest of the proto-colonial master and later the colonial master. So you would see a certain kind of tweaking as well as manipulation of an internal indigenous Malayali episteme to fit into the mold of the production of Western science. And when you go through this process, you would also see that the elements of what could have been indicators or pointers towards Indic knowledge production networks is completely being erased as we move ahead from Linnaeus to Boerhaave to other modern botanists in the 19th and the 20th century. So from bioprospecting ventures, we move 2 centuries ahead and then we land up at, last slide please, at colonial forestry, where the forest now becomes an absolute resource base. Where initially when you have bioprospecting ventures, this was imagined to be a space which would lead to maybe helping vested colonial interest in terms of items being also indexed as well as listed into larger colonial networks of exchange. But it was still, the forest was still an area of knowledge production, because at least people were gathering knowledge about the forest, they were documenting it. But by the time you reach the 18th century, the forest becomes an absolute resource base, where you would have forest surveys being done, counting of trees in the forest, the forest being thought of in absolute utilitarian terms, where you have entire forest being replanted, like in the case of the Nilambur forest, where you would have monocrop cultivation emerging in the forest in terms of teak wood being cultivated, in terms of willow wood being cultivated. And you have new forests which are not natural forests, where when you would imagine a forest in the pre-colonial context, there would be trees of all kind. But in the colonial forest, you might not have trees which are diverse in nature. You would see trees which are of the same nature, because these were also carefully constructed forests. So one can see the shaping of a new kind of environment, which Vinita Damodaran talks about, which Anita Winterbottom talks about, and Philippa Levine talks about with regard to India, Indonesia, and Southeast Asian nations. So the environment which was shaped and fashioned under the colonial gaze through colonial governmentality also led to a very monolithized thinking about the forest. And unfortunately, generations and generations of people were educated about the forest in very particular ways, which followed the colonial gaze. Which meant that when our fathers or grandfathers or our grandmothers and our mothers were taught about the forest was always taught in terms of binary divisions between the forest and the village, where the forest was thought of as a place where you would get animal and other and plant products from. So the various ways in which the forest could be imagined, all of these were subsumed under the idea of the forest as the resource base. So, and let me stop with that. Thank you. Let me also add one final remark. So the larger idea here is not only to make you think about forest in multiple ways and to inform you about the various ways in which the space of the forest was thought of and represented and constructed in the pre-colonial past. This is also to inform you about the dangers of a single narrative, which is the larger picture that we all have to be very concerned about. Okay, let me stop with that.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I know you will have a few questions now, but before we move to our Q&A session, I would like to invite Aditi Zakaria, the Director of Kerala Museum, to speak a few words.
Hi everyone, the 13th JANAL Lecture done and dusted. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today, contributing your ideas and all of that. So from, bright light, from the Madhavan Nair Foundation, the Kerala Museum and the JANAL team, a big thank you, our gratitude. We'd like to give you a small token of our appreciation. This is light reading for someone like you, but it gives you another picture of Kerala. We'll move to the Q&A, which is the part that everyone really enjoys the most, but for live, we're cutting the stream now so that, because our battery might run out, and yeah. So Floor is open. Anyone wants to ask a question, please do so. Our numbers are there for contact and for following our social page. And if you want to receive updates, please save the number and then send us a message and say that you want to receive the updates as well. Most importantly, we'd like to thank the Geojit Foundation for supporting this series of experimental, forays into history and bringing such high-quality speakers here with, bizarre thoughts and bizarre connections, but very important for all of us to start thinking along those lines.